All right, little computer problem there. Interesting. Anyway, so Gabriel shows up in Muhammad's world in a cave, and he gives him the Quran as a way of his newfound religious emphasis. Very fascinating that that is also the same exact method that Joseph Smith saw in Mormonism, exactly the same thing. Only the angel was called Moroni instead of Gabriel, and he was given tablets just like Mr. Muhammad was, and there's a special dispensation on how to read them and whole 9 yards. Now, other key writings though for Islam is the biblical law of Moses. The law of Moses is read in Islam, as are the Psalms of David. Those that ascribe to David, they are accepted in the Quran. They are notified as key writings. And another thing, believe it or not, and I know it's going to sound crazy, it's called the Injil, I-N-J-I-L, but it is the gospel of Jesus. I know you didn't expect that, but Islam accepts Judaism and Christianity. They're called people of the book. That's their subtitle for that, believe it or not. Now, once those things were originally written, however, all those things, the Psalms, the law, the gospel, current Muslim scholars say that they were corrupted by Christian leaders and Jewish leaders, and therefore they are to be suspect, to be careful, treated well. And by the way, the Mormons say the same exact thing. Mormons say that the book of the Bible is great. The Bible is great. The King James in particular, as long as it's correctly interpreted. That's an interesting thing. There isn't a hair's worth of difference between the interpretation of any version of scripture. But according to the Mormons, some texts are not interpreted right in order they don't fit with the Book of Mormon. And more so to the DNC, which is the Doctrines of Covenants. Because as you may know, Doctrines and Covenants is the main book of belief in Mormonism. It's not the Book of Mormon. People get that really confused. You get the Book of Mormon, I frankly would encourage you to get the Book of Mormon, because it's just a history book and it's so poorly written. It's literally one of those things where you'll be laughing. I mean, it's just like, really? It's terrible. Doctrine of Covenants, though, is a different thing, or the Pearl of Great Price, completely different, okay? Because to me, the Book of Mormon is just history. I mean, it's just like reading the Encyclopedia Britannica. There's nothing to it, except it comes from Joseph Smith's perspective. Who is God? Well, in what do you call it? Islam, who is God is Allah. And he's called the One, capital O-N-E. He is the One, capital O-N-E. The greatest sin in Islam is called shirk, S-H-I-R-K. And that's when you assign something to God that isn't true. You and I would call it blasphemy. That's very fascinating. Yeah, and Efren, it is a loophole. It is definitely a loophole. You have the ability to chat with me directly, by the way. There's a little chat function if you have any questions or comments that you just want to chat with. Many Muslims think that Christians believe in 3 gods and therefore are guilty of shirk. That is ascribing to God something that isn't true. You follow that? So if that's the case, then they consider that to be blasphemous. Now, maybe you're not familiar with church history, but just so you understand, in the 1st century, Christians started the term in modern thought anyway, called atheism. Christians were called atheists. And the reason because we didn't believe in all the polytheistic ways of the Greeks and Romans. We didn't believe in Apollo and Zeus and Aphrodite and all that. We didn't attend any of those what do you call it, ceremonies or their temples, and ergo we were called atheists. We didn't really believe in the gods. No gods. Atheists. Fascinating, huh? Kind of weird. Anyway, they do not look at Allah as a father. There's no human attribute ever given to Allah. Allah is extremely stern. He's not a personable, relatable type of person you'd like to get to be with. He's more or less, I wouldn't call him Brahmin, Allah the Hindu, but he is not a friendly cat, okay? According to the Quran, Jesus was a prophet, but he was one of 124,000 prophets sent by Allah to mankind. The last, of course, in the line, which I'll talk about more later, is, of course, Muhammad. According to Islam, Jesus was sinless, born a virgin, great miracle worker, but not the Son of God. It's very fascinating what they choose to believe and what they don't believe. According to Islam lore, his virgin birth was very similar to Adam's creation. So therefore, Jesus is not God, God is not Jesus. There is no Trinity per se. Make sense? Had some feedback there for a second. I don't know where it went. Okay. Allah is mainly spirit. So there is no body, physical, unlike the Mormons who believe God is in fact physical. Yeah, other than that, that's good. Now the media tends to overlook the modern 350 million people who subscribe to the Sharia law of Islam. In fact, George Bush Jr. Said that Islam was a peaceful religion. Well, if you read the Quran, there's no way you can think that. It's just the opposite. He talks about slicing off people's heads and creating contracts with infidels and then stabbing them in the back, and they use a long sword, and it's actually mentioned in there of how to do it in the Quran. It's not a peaceful religion per se, if you follow it literally as it says, which we will debate here in a minute. How to be saved is also in your notes. Let me just run through that real quick. Humans are basically good, but need guidance. That's the way Islam looks at it. Their way of thinking of it is like a, what do they call those? A scale. If you have enough good things, it counteracts the bad things, and you'll end up in paradise or eternal destiny based on that scale. You can also end up in hell based on that scale. Allah's mercy is what it's called, may tip the balances to heaven, as Allah is 100% supreme. So whatever he decides, even though you've been an icky person, like you've had cats in your life, you've voted certain ways, stuff like that. Oh, well, sorry, you're out. And Allah has the ability to recover you or send you directly to wherever he wants. It's a very fascinating little thing. What happens after death? Resurrection of body happens. Fear of eternal torment is a prevalent thing in the Quran. Fear of eternal torment. Paradise includes a garden populated with maidens, young girls designed by Allah to provide sexual pleasure to righteous men. It's mainly a dominated patriarchal society. As I talked about before, there's official discrimination, if you will, toward women. Other beliefs and practices, I can go on and on about this, but I'm going to talk to you about the 5 pillars of Islam. That's something that a lot of people don't know or have gotten it confused, and we'll talk about that. But before I do, any question you want to throw my way, as always, I pause after every major section and then before I get to the other practices. This is not the good Arizona iced tea I've come to love, and for those of you who watch me on Q3, I always have my iced tea with me. Susan let me down today. She couldn't find it. It's gone. I should keep my mouth shut because people are probably going out and buying this stuff, and now I can't find any of it. So I've got some screwball black tea. Ew. Anyway, okay, so let's talk a little bit about other practices. The word Islam literally means surrender, just so you know that. This is a surrendering type of thing. It's the fundamental religious idea of Islam that the believer accepts and surrenders himself to Allah's will. You'll hear that all the time. You'll see it in movies too, though they over-exaggerate it, but it is the idea of Allah's will. There's no question about that. Allah is viewed as monotheistic. Remember, there is polytheistic, panentheistic, pantheistic, and of course, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity is monotheistic. That is, there's one God, he's the creator, he's the sustainer, he's the restorer of the world. All that kind of stuff is exactly right. And in that degree, they've got it wrong, even though they've got the wrong view of Allah. They've got the concepts correct. Human beings have got to submit to the sacred scriptures, as you know, in Quran, but there's a whole slew of that. Now, Muhammad being the last of a series of prophets, some of the big prophets out of the Bible that are in the Quran as a list of righteous prophets include Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Solomon, and Jesus. I'll say those again. Adam, how they get that he's a prophet is beyond me. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Solomon, a prophet, and Jesus. Now remember, prophet has 2 different definitions. The first one is somebody who predicts the future. Another one is somebody who proclaims truth. And 85% of the time in the Bible where you find the word prophet, it's a proclaimer, it's not a predictor. It's a proclaimer of the truth. And in some degrees, some people actually have a bit of, quote, prophet in them, in that they are more interested in the truth than anything else. And you'll find some of that kind of stuff from time to time in popular Christian writers and or, teachers. But the way they look at it as prophet, they are talking about one of the 124,000 that have been sent to the world. And they believe these 6 are big boys, okay? And when Muhammad speaks, they consider that to be the last and final revelation. That's it. Why? I don't know, because Muhammad is nothing special in history whatsoever. In fact, you could argue that his life is more determined than Muhammad was. He's a fairly meek guy comparatively. So when the Muslim hordes took over the Middle East and some of Europe, in particular Turkey, and Asia Minor, and certainly North Africa, they would run into Jews and Christians. Now, Jews and Christians, because they believed in Jesus and Abraham, were considered to be, well, people of the book. So they were allowed to continue to do their Jewish religion, worship stuff. Christians were allowed to do exactly the same thing, but they were given an economic fee in order for them to do that, that was paid to the local constabulary. So if they took over your country, they would allow you to do what you want to do. They'd give you a certain amount of autonomy. It's called a jizya, Jizyah, jizya. And all it is a levy, monetary levy, that was given to you every month that you had to, and remember their months are completely different than ours, not even close. In fact, their years are different. They count their years completely different. But the point being is that you could do what you wanted to do. It's just it was going to cost you a fortune. Well, what do you think what do you think is the reaction of most Christian and Jews in that scenario? One word. Speak. You hit the space bar. Speak. Oh, guess.
Rebellion?
Nope.
Wouldn't they consider that in like worshiping another god?
Well, they would if you thought that,
because they're paying the money to be able to worship the god. So
yeah, no, they didn't really care about that. But the point being is that if they wanted to avoid that little fee, even though it wasn't little, a lot of them converted. They gave up their, literally converted. They gave up their Jewish line and they threw away the Christian creeds and followed the 5 pillars we're going to talk about.
A question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Didn't the United States pay some type of fee back in the day during Washington's presidency to Islam terrorists, because we used to pay part of our budget was for.
Sorry, you're cutting out there a little, Efren, but
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any fee paid by Washington. I'm not aware of that. Sorry, don't have any information for that one.
Okay, the reason I was saying that, I was going to say that I heard this through a show called Wall Builders. I used to hear when I come back from work. I teach in Patterson, so I heard that. I wasn't too sure. I was looking for it. I said maybe you had that information as well.
Yeah, sorry, don't know anything about that. I do know this. I do know that throughout history, there have always been faker Christian people. Always. When Nero in 64 AD, which again, we will talk about this at the church history side, but when Nero blamed the Christians for the burning of Rome, even though he himself said it, that's a very long story. He used to burn bodies in his garden. He would wrap them with garlic, and at night he couldn't sleep, so he'd run his chariot. These gardens were massive, and he would have people there, and he would light the thing on fire so he could see his flowers. And one of those got out of control, and the whole bloody half of Rome went up, and he had to find a scapegoat, and he blamed the Christians. Well, the Christians went underground into what is called the catacombs of Rome. You know, we today worry about the fact that the church can't meet, the church can't sing, the church can't well, you do realize that the majority of life in the church in 3/4 of the world has been like that forever. I mean, they can't sing, they couldn't, people had to be underground like crazy. Literally underground. It was quite, you talk about dedication. Jeez. But anyway, the point being is that Nero would go around finding Christians out in the hinterland from Rome and persecute them. Very interesting stuff, you know, and the only way that people really could stay alive was to be kind to townspeople. And they were lights, literally, and people would cover for them because they didn't like Rome either. So it's very fascinating. Anyway, the point being is that some people didn't. They capitulated to Rome and started worshiping Jupiter and other types of gods. Well, when the Roman persecution stopped, because remember, it's not constant throughout all of history. It's always on again, off again, on again, off again, depending on who is the emperor at the time. If it was Diocletian, ew, you're in trouble. But if it was somebody like Marcus Aurelius, he's such a narcissist, it didn't really matter unless you came inside his view. Anyway, the point being is that imagine that you lost everything. They took your house, they took your kids, and you're there running a little shop, and you're going to a local church, and some people who'd been a part of your church capitulated so they could stay open. And now it's no longer bad to be a Christian, and everybody meets at the church. And there's the guy who gave in, sitting right next to you, who you lost your 3 kids. You'd have a heck of time accepting that guy as not only a believer, not only as a communion guy that you got to have communion right next to, or B, if that guy becomes a leader. Problem, real problem. Well, it's the same thing here when all these Christians, which there were tons of them in Alexandria, for an example, in Egypt, and some of them just bailed on the faith. They just bailed. And as far as I'm concerned, now biblically, this is not a theology class, but I think there's a big question as to whether or not they were believers in the first place. That would really, I would have trouble with that a little bit. Now, if you weren't a Christian or a Jew and the Islam hordes took over your country, guess what happened? You either converted or you died. You either converted or your head was chopped off publicly. Ew. You talk about, a motivation to, you wonder why Islam grew? Well, I can tell you why it grew. It had nothing to do with, oh boy, let's go be part of the 5 pillars. It wasn't any of that. It was like, holy cow, we're going to lose our kids, our goat, our house, everything. So sure, which way is Mecca? I'll bow right towards it. So anyway, just so you understand that. Islam spread the whole world, and the main reason why is because Muslims at the time were great traders. So they had all sorts of Muslim traders, camels going all over the place, including Indonesia in the 14th century. That's one of the reasons why Indonesia is Muslim. It's because of traders, ship traders. So that's T-R-A-D-E-R, trader, kind of like the Hudson Bay Company for the English. And so they were and they brought their lovely thing with them. Okay, now let's talk real quick about their 4 main sources of inspiration before we talk about the 5 pillars. Doctrine, law, thinking in general are based in 4 main sources. One, of course, is the Quran. Another one's called the Sunnah, S-U-N-N-A-H. You can put in parentheses the traditions. These are Islamic fathers who have written all sorts of things. The next one's called IJMA, Ijma. That's called the consensus. And fourth, it's called the Ijtihad, I-J-T-I-H-A-D, I-J-T-I-H-A-D. And that's called individual thought. Now, the Quran means specifically to be the spoken word, right? Everybody kind of understands that. But what most people don't know is that the Quran is broken up in 114 surahs, S-U-R-A. And these are more or less chapters, but they're not of the same length in any sense. And in some cases, as far as I could tell, the stuff I've read of it, I can't tell what makes one versus what makes another. Now, the majority of it is aimed at the ethical and spiritual teachings toward the day of judgment. So when the day of judgment happens, say goodnight. That's the majority of it. So it's always talking about way in the future, nothing now, blah, 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 majority of it. The stuff that was found in the prophet's house by Muhammad's followers 100 years after this whole thing started, and it started very, very meekly and very small. It didn't jump heavily. But it talks a lot about the political moral principles of what Islam is purporting for and how a Muslim should behave. Those, on the other hand, are quite feisty, and they coordinate the community, and they're, what do you call it, rigid. There's no wiggle room here. There's none of this, well, anyway, you get the idea. Now, the Sunnah, or Sunnah, that literally means well-trodden path, by the way. Well-trodden path. That's the literal meaning of what that word is. This is basically their book of common law. If we were to go back in English history, you would find that there is such a thing called the Common Book of Law. It's more or less a place in English lore way back in the 14th and 15th century. And these are the things that you commonly go through. It's, in fact, I'm trying to think what the term was. There's a term I wanted, because the Sunnis have something different than the Shiites. Okay, here we go. It's called the Hadith. Hadith, Hadith. In Sunni, there are 6 Hadiths. These are common law. In Shiite, there's 4, and they're different. And they emphasize certain things. It would be very similar to the Pharisees and what they believed versus the Sadducees and what they believed. And I think the Sunnis are the bigger of the two, but it's been a long time since I've looked that up, so you'll have to look that up yourself. But I think the Shiites aren't exactly the friendliest of the group. I can't remember. The consensus, the Ijma, IJMA, that one is the standardized legal theory when regional differences come up in Islam. In other words, Catholics, by the way, have done this forever. Syncretism is what they've done. Catholics will, if they go to Jamaica versus Germany, the rules are different in the two countries. Even their dogma is different in the two countries because Catholics have been famous for taking whatever's going on in the country and incorporating it into the service or the mass. Well, these guys are the same way, and they use it through this ijma thing. Okay? And then the individual thought one, that's when something is new, a new problem comes up and it's not addressed in the Quran. This ijtihad, however you say it, this is where an individual opinion comes up and they have a method on how to define the new problem. Like, for example, legalize marijuana. You know, the church still hasn't dealt with that because, you know, what the heck are you supposed to do with that? When we get to Scientology, we'll see what they did with it. But Islam has a way of dealing with each new problem, and you go through this individual conscious thing, which then goes to this supreme court of the land, so to speak, to run through whatever the issue is. In the church, for example, we just have forms of opinion. For years, people have been saying, well, how come you don't smoke marijuana? Well, it's against the law. That's a terrible, by the way, that's a terrible reason. That nobody cares what the law says. Comparatively, what the moral code is, that trumps the law every time. And now that it's legal, which I'm sure the next bit of drugs will be illegal, I mean, be legalized, surely, as you know, as Solomon said, once the horse is out of the gate, it's too late to lock the barn. Well, that's a fact. And now that people are ignoring some of the things, there's no doubt in my mind that we're heading to legalize drugs, just like it was in 1800. 1800 Europe had nothing but opium dens everywhere. And people were smoking hashish and heroin and all that stuff. Vladimir, if you've seen the movie Tombstone, Vladimir, you know, Doc Holliday is taking that stuff. That's pure opium. I mean, it's just like taking, starts with morphine. It's just like the same thing, only in liquid form. So we're going to get there. Now the question is how do you deal with that as a church? That's a difficult thing. Okay, well, anyway, enough of that. 5 pillars. Those are the 4 major thinking doctrinal thoughts: common laws, traditions, the Hadith, etc. But what are the 5 pillars of Islam? Number 1 is the profession of faith. I won't bother you with the title of it because it doesn't really matter, because you can look this up almost anywhere. And the profession of faith goes like this. There is no deity but God, and Muhammad is a messenger of God. They say that constantly. It's no different than the rosary. It's no different than Hail Marys. It's no different than, blah, blah, blah. When that is recited at least once in one's lifetime, aloud correctly and purposefully, and you understand and believe it in your heart, then those are in fact considered to be a Muslim. So the profession of faith is the big boy. It's the first pillar that everything sits on. Okay? Follow? Okay, number 2 is prayer. There are 5 daily canonical prayers. They are set prayers. They offered individually if somebody is not able to go to a mosque. But as a general rule, the first one is done before sunrise. The second one is done just after noon. The third one is done late in the afternoon, like 4 or 5. Fourth one immediately after sunset. And the fifth one is before you retire to bed. They're called the 5 prayers of Islam. Before any of these prayers happen, there's all sorts of absolution. Absolution meaning, washing of your feet and getting yourself prepped and all that kind of stuff. Hands, face, blah, blah, blah. And as a general rule, you're supposed to figure out where Mecca is and aim your prayer that direction toward the holy site. They're big on these sites. Generally speaking, there are verses that are recited in these prayers, including the one that says, God is great. That's a quote. God is great. And of course, they do it in Arabic. Tradition has fixed all the materials. There's some prostrations. There's some genuflections. You see these guys, you'll see them in lines, and they'll rise up and do something, and then they'll go down, face down all the way. These are all traditions that are set up, and they all do the same thing. On Friday, instead of a prayer, just afternoon, the one that's just afternoon on Fridays, you're supposed to make your way to a mosque and there's a sermon, a normal everyday sermon. Generally speaking, it's in the local language, but there's also a certain formula that is repeated in Arabic, believe it or not. Yeah, there's nothing more to say that. Even if you're sick, you can't waive this thing. Even if you have to lay down, and this thing is that important to them. The third pillar is called the zakat, Z-A-K-A-T. This is a tax. The zakat literally means purification. And basically, it's you're making payment on one's own wealth. This is payable annually sometimes. There's a tax levied by the Quran. Food, grains, cattle, cash after 1 year's possession, you're supposed to give it to the mosque. There's all sorts, and I mean, it is. If you think tithing is a tough thing to figure out, because tithing isn't what people think. It's not 10%. That's all myth. Tithing is 23% in the Jewish law. Abraham, Moses, Isaac. There's a tithe for this, tithe for that. Anyway, it ends up being 20. There's a tithe that happens every 3rd year, and they do the exact same thing as these guys do. They're yearly tithes. Those tithes in the Old Testament include all that you have, a 10th once, a 10th again, and then every 3rd year, one more. It ends up being 23.5%. Make a very long story short, because the word means 10th. Everybody thinks that it's a 10% tithe of your income in the New Testament, but in the New Testament, they fulfill it by saying whatever's in your heart. So it could be anything. It doesn't really, the main idea is for you to be loyal to the Lord. In Islam, this thing is crazy. There's 10% if it's land. If it's land watered by rain, it's 10%. If it's land watered artificially, it's 5%. If it's cash or precious gems or metals that you've gained over that year, it's 2.5%. Anyway, the zakat, as a general rule, believe this or not, isn't really meant to make the mosque all pretty, even though they do that. If you've ever been in a foreign country and saw a mosque, it's ridiculous how ornate they are. But as a general rule, the way I learned this was it was alms for the poor, and that's exactly what they do with it. They're aiming to go into slums and help the poor. Now, what does that do for Islam? Well, what it does is it endears the poor people to the Islamic thing. It's kind of like those people who are on the far, far, far left in American politics. They want people to be on welfare. They want people to be on social assistance of all sorts, mainly because it endears them to the government, and the government then rules almost everything from healthcare to anything. It's the same kind of thing. If you've never read Saul Alinsky, or if you've never read Adam Smith, that's all economic theory that is all out there. It's the same thing. And I don't know exactly why Mr. Mohammed put that in there, but it's the third pillar, no question. Those tithes, tax is what it is, because you don't have any choice on this one. They literally take it from you, will go toward the poor. Okay? Make sense? Questions, argument, debate? Okay. The fourth one is fasting during the month of Ramadan. It's the 9th month of the lunar calendar, by the way. This thing is a pillar of faith. It begins at daybreak and ends at sunset during that month, every day. And so during the day, eating, drinking, smoking are forbidden. It's interesting they would put smoking in there. Now, I've known many a Muslim and American Muslim, and most of them don't do any of this stuff. They don't pay attention to any of that. And so once sunset has happened, then you can go about your drinking. And it's kind of like intermittent fasting, which is a big rage these days, making sure you have 16 hours of not eating anything. That's supposed to be really good for you for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why, but it's supposed to be. And that's exactly what they're doing here. And then the fifth pillar is called the pilgrimage, otherwise known as the Hajj, H-A-J-J. The Hajj is that the Quran prescribes that every Muslim once in a lifetime has to go to Mecca. Quote, provided one can afford it, unquote. You're supposed to have enough provisions to leave your family and go, I can't remember exactly when it is, but it takes a while. It's not just like a visit, hey, there I am, and then it's a process, you know, like we're talking like maybe 10 days there, that kind of thing. I'm trying to think, there's all sorts of stuff I could tell you about there, but I don't know that that matters. Okay, any questions before I go on to Baha'i faith? Okay, well then those of you who downloaded the notes, you can turn your page over, as I will. I'm on page 5 on those notes. They're basically all the same. Baha'i faith is a really wild thing, and if I was going to be anybody, I told you if I wasn't going to be a Christian last week, I said I'd be a Buddhist. No doubt in my mind, I'd be a Buddhist. So much fun to just not feel or think anything. How refreshing that's got to be. Stress-free. Well, Baha'i faith is right up there as well in my mind. If I'm not going to be a Christian, for crying out loud, Baha'i faith, I mean, if I'm unified with all of mankind and all the, what do you call it? All the divinities all meet the same place, well, yay. So Baha'i faith. Oh, here, maybe I should follow your little note. I do have a little thing on that one. Okay, founder. The guy's name is Syed, S-I-Y-Y-I-D. Ali Muhammad. That's his full name. Syed Ali Muhammad. That's the guy that started, otherwise known as the Bab, B-A-B. He is born in 1819, dies in 1850. There's another person that really throws this whole thing into religious status. But the bottom line, it was founded in 1844 in Iran. Today's headquarters for Baha'i Faith is in Haifa, Israel. Do you believe that? That's just funny. I've never been to Haifa because it's all the way up to Lebanon. I never have enough time to get up there, but I understand the gardens are ridiculous. And Haifa is the biggest seaport for Israel. It's where all the docks and stuff like that are. You know, it's right up against the Lebanon border. And this is where Baha'i Faith is headquartered. The writings, geez. Let me just tell you this, because I can't even pronounce these guys' names, but you can look it up. Most Holy Book is the title of it. Secondly, is the Book of Certitude. Those are the Book of Certitude. Now, you can look either one of those up under Baha'i Faith. Just put it in Google, Baha'i Faith, Most Holy Book, Book of Certitude, and you'll figure out the names if you're interested. But believe me, they're unpronounceable. The Bible is also a part of their writings, but it has to be correctly spiritually interpreted. I just love that. Yeah, I don't take it for what it says. You can bend it to whatever you want it to say. That's really terrific. Brilliant. God is a unknowable divine being who has made himself at least known a bit. Now catch this. This is the big part. In 9 manifestations of himself. They believe these 9 represent the divine being. And if you go to that temple, you will see 9 doors. It's a 9-door auditorium. There'll be a guy there that'll have Moses. There'll be a statue of Jesus, a statue of Sahatra. There's a, et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. So what are those manifestations? According to Baha'i Faith, the 9 leaders who represent God's attempt to describe himself through these 9 include Adam, Moses, Krishna. That one's funny to me, sorry. It reminds me of the 70s with the airports. Anyway, Krishna, Hare Krishna. In Oregon, there was a guy in Antelope, Oregon that thought he was the manifestation of Krishna, Hare Krishna, and they took over the town and created this. I didn't put it on our list, but because they took him out, the IRS took him out. Anyway, Adam, Moses, Krishna, Buddha, Jesus, Mohammed, and of course, the guy that started Baha'i Faith, it's Muhammad is the Bab, but there's a guy who also founded it. I'll just spell it to you, and then you can look it up yourself. BAHA space U space LLAH. Bahalua. Sounds like that Disney thing, Balu. Anyway, so he's unknowable divine. He's revealed himself through the 9 manifestations, including those dudes. How you're saved? Well, it's knowing and living by Baha'u'llah principles and teachings, because he's the main writer of Baha'i Faith. What happens after death? Personal immortality is achieved strictly on good works. Heaven and hell are not places, they're conditions. Okay, got all that? Okay, so Baha'u'llah, whatever that guy's name is, he's the guy that was the real power behind it, even though Syed Ali Muhammad the Bab also was a major player in it. Baha'u'llah is Arabic. It means glory to God or glory of God, either one. And the cornerstone of Baha'i faith is that the Bab, this Sidya Ali Muhammad, is a manifestation of God who, in his essence, is really unknowable. The main thing with Baha'i faith is that there's essential unity of all religions and essential unity of all humanity. So Baha'i believe that all the founders of the world's religions, great religions, I'll say that, have been manifestations of God and are agents of a progressive divine plan for the education of the human race. So as these people have come about, even though there is clear apparent differences between all of them, ostensibly Baha'i faith says that they teach identical truth, which is baloney. That's just, I mean, I cannot tell you how baloney that is. If you read any length of Allah's stuff with Mr. Muhammad, you find immediately it's nothing like the Christian side. If you read anything of Buddhism, you know that's nothing like Christianity. Zero. They're not even in the same zip code. So, but they think that's correct. So Baha'u'llah's peculiar, his function in life is to overcome the disunity of religions and bring them all together. That was what he said. They have no priesthood. You become righteous by believing in the oneness of humanity and devoting yourself to the abolition of racial, social, and class prejudice. That's what they're all about. They have no ritual forms of worship, none of it. Let's see here. What else do we want to tell you? Bottom line is it started in Iran and it started to get popular. And originally it started in the Shiite community. And of course, in the Shiite community, they were not too happy with this guy, you know? So let's see here. I'm losing what happened here? I'm losing my, weird. I don't know how that happened. Oh, well, there we go. So according to Baha'i faith rules, there's a 19-day feast at the first day of each month. Catch that, 19 days out of 31. Every month. You talk about gaining weight during lockdown, you're gonna gain like crazy. Are you kidding me? However, if you're capable, people who are between the ages of 15 and 70 are required to fast 19 days a year. I don't know what this fascination is with 19, but 19 seems to be a good thing. And according to their fast, or what their rules are, that you go without food or drink from sunrise to sunset. So it's kind of like the Islam thing. During this feast thing, you're supposed to get together for prayer, reading of scriptures, which of course are the writings of these Baha'u'llah people, Baha'u'llah man, and the discussion of community activities and enjoyment of one another's company. Now, if you, in your notes, put down Acts 2:42 through 47 and take a look at that after we're done, you're gonna find a lot of commonality. You know, communion, fellowship with one another, devote yourself to apostles' teaching, blah, 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 prayer. It's almost word for word. Okay? The local level has the election of the spiritual assembly. There is really a loose hierarchical thing. However, the local assembly creates a delegate to the National Assembly, and they have this thing called the Universal House of Justice. And the Universal House of Justice is kind of like their supreme governing body. So they're kind of like the Mormon Church in that regard. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with how that works, but the president of the Mormon Church is up here. They have 12 dudes that represent the council. And then they have 144 representing the different various parts of the world. And it's the same kind of thing. And then they upgrade. Same thing with the Catholics and the College of the Cardinals. There's no difference. I don't know if you knew this, but in the Catholic Church, the entire world is divided into segments. with arch, is it arc or arch? Can't remember. Arch cardinal guys that are in charge of each one of those segments. And I think there's 57, 58 ones in the Catholic Church. And then there's a hierarchy that goes above that, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, the College of the Cardinal are the people who elect the Pope. It's the same thing with this, okay? It's called the Universal House of Justice. So if you want to be a Baha'i faith, you can believe in almost anything and pick the one you want and cheers. You got to be kidding me. You know, here's a good word for you, syncretism. It's where they take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and that's exactly what Baha'i faith has done. They're taking a little bit of this fast, they're taking a little bit of this hierarchy, they're taking a little bit of this action, and they create a religion. You know, we should start our own religion. We could make a fortune. We could, like, what could I use? Oh, here, we'll use this. If you take a sip of this, all your troubles will go away. And we'll just tell everybody on the internet, we'll tell everybody, send, what, $9.95 for the thing of holy water, and we will make an absolute fortune. And then, of course, we can use it to be evangelistic after the fact. Of course, I'm kidding, but that's just about how it is. I saw an article where the guy was actually arrested for mail fraud, which I didn't really understand. All he did was he took out an ad in the National Enquirer, and he said, send $1 to this post office box. $287,000. He didn't say he was going to give him anything. He didn't say he was going to send him anything. He just said, send one. And sure enough, 287,000 people sent $1. We could get $10 for this. I guarantee it. I digress. Okay, one of my favorites, Scientology, mainly because Tom Cruise and John Travolta, two very good actors, are very much in the news about all this stuff. If you remember Tom Cruise, he was jumping up and down on Oprah's couch a few years ago. That was quite entertaining. He literally lost it. I don't know exactly what. I don't know if it was drugs. I don't know if it was this stuff we're going to talk about right now. I don't know. But again, there are so many interesting religions out there. Just to pick 12, it was just really tough to select. But Scientology, to me, is one of the more entertaining, let's put it that way. Now, how many of you guys have ever heard of Scientology? I mean, like, you know it, like, okay. Has anybody ever heard of L. Ron Hubbard? Okay, that's the founder. L, I don't know what L stands for. Ron Hubbard. Oh, it's Lafayette. It's Lafayette. My notes show that. Believe it or not, is born in 1911 in Nebraska. How he ended up doing it from Nebraska. You would think a farm guy would be a solid Christian dude, but no, he just decides that he wants to do it. He wrote a treatise called Dianetics. That's the crux of it, Dianetics. Just like it sounds, D-I-A-N-E-T-I-C. And colon, The Modern Science of Mental Health. It was printed in 1950. The Modern Science of Mental Health. Hubbard's goal was to analyze humankind's mental aberrations, which of course there's quite a few, especially for the cat lovers in the group. He eventually moved away from Dianetics' focus on the mind to more religious approaches to the human conditions. And that's when he decided, because this guy's quite the thinker, to start a Church of Scientology, which was started in 1954. Oh, I was going to give you all the other things too. I know I've got a little deal here about that too. Yeah, and the church started in California. Land of fruits and nuts, that's us. And it's currently headquartered in Los Angeles, California, and you can go down there. You got to get by the armed guards that are on every corner. I've been there. It is it looks like a compound. Like you can't just walk in there. Let's just put it that way. There's another book as far as key writings go called The Way to Happiness. that is also an L. Ron Hubbard type of deal. Hubbard is very prolific. He writes a lot. The idea of God, it doesn't really define God or a supreme being, but it rejects completely any of the biblical reference of God. So this is going to get very complicated, and I'm going to go slow as I can, but this Dianetic thing is not exactly simple. God, what is it? God isn't really there in it's not like a force like Brahman. It's not a nirvana type of thing like Buddha, but it's more like you yourself are eternal, and you've been given what they call, and I'm quoting now, hang-ups. If you ever remember that in the 60s, people would, man, what's your hang-up? From the drug culture of LSD, if you remember Timothy or Leary. Anyway, you, believe it or not, are a thetan, Thetan, thetan. You've been around forever, and you have been engaged in, it's kind of like reincarnation, various things that have caused your mind to deteriorate so it's not operating fully. Bummer. I actually kind of relate to that one. Exactly. My brain has deteriorated, so I'm not operating fully. Good job there, Mr. Hubbard. Jesus is rarely mentioned in the Scientology. He's not the creator. He's not even an operating thetan, which we'll talk about what an operating thetan is compared to a regular one. Jesus did not die for sins. Holy Spirit's not a part of this belief. So all that stuff is out the window. When it comes to salvation, there is no sin, so therefore there's no need to repent. Salvation, catch this, is the same thing as Buddhism. It is freedom from reincarnation. You gotta love that. I am absolutely positive I had a prior incident with a cat in my prior lives, because it's clear that me and cats don't get along. Salvation is a loose term, so I'll just use it, but it's not what it means like what you and I think of it. But salvation is only found when you clear up. In fact, they call it clear up your engrams, and you do that through an auditor of the Scientology. You have to have an auditor in your life. When it comes to death, hell is a myth. People who get clear of engrams become what is known as an operating thetan. An operating thetan. You're a thetan, but you're all clouded up with all these hang-ups that you've developed over the years and over the lifetimes, and they've got to get rid of them. Okay? You got that? So let's go to other beliefs. So let me talk a little bit about Hubbard for a minute. Let me put this on the back of your, on the margin. Hubbard went to George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I've been there. Beautiful, beautiful place. He never got his degree because he decided to be a writer, and he became like a magazine writer, like a Harlequin romance type of writer. He did all sorts of horror, Western, Louis L'Amour type stuff, science fiction. He did all sorts of, which science fiction, there you go. No wonder. And he was very popular in his contributions to those kinds of magazines. He also, in 1940-41, right before World War II, he became what is called a master of steam and motor vessels. And he became this guy that became very connected to boats. That's going to play in here in a minute. During World War II, he was a naval intelligence officer based in Australia and aboard several vessels in the US. Make a long story short, he ended the war as a patient of Oak Knoll Naval Hospital in Oakland, California, suffering from several war-related ailments. And it's there that he started considering all his thoughts about the human problem in particular the mind. And it was systematic. He created this thing called the original thesis. You can look that up. You can find that if you want to, you know, bedtime reading when you're having trouble sleeping. It'll put you right to sleep. But bottom line is his joint thought was that Hubbard believed that the basic principle that was guiding human existence was survival. So this kind of goes back to some of the books I was talking about on Q3. I do this show at 2 o'clock every day, Monday through Saturday. Take anybody's questions about anything. And we went through the worst 10 books ever written. And we went through each and every one of them. And one of them is talking about something just like this, that somehow that mankind is just an animal. And therefore, I love my dogs. Just an animal and looking to survive, hence the survival of the fittest. Do you ever hear that phrase out of Mr. Darwin? Which, by the way, is not his best book by any stretch, but the Descent of Man is the one you've got to look up. There he argues for eugenics through and through for civilization. By the way, Darwin is buried in Westminster Abbey in London. The fact, the minute you walk in the door, I've been to Westminster many times, and you step right on his grave almost immediately. Weird that he never stopped being an Anglican believer. Interesting dude. Okay, anyway, so survival's that, and so therefore all of life is just trying to survive. Therefore, actions that support survival are good. Actions that perpetuate negative state is bad. He argued that every person has a mind that under normal circumstances operates analytically. And obviously analytically to make survival-oriented judgment. Ergo, anybody who doesn't make that kind of analytical mind is obviously not fully functioning. And since your mind stores experiences, whether it's in this life or previous ones, you, in fact, have clouded mind space, otherwise known in his book as negative emotional reaction to these things that happened to you in previous lives. He calls them engrams, E-N-G-A-R-A-M. To help people bring those engrams to their consciousness and confront them and eliminate them, Hubbard developed an auditing program, a one-on-one counseling process in which a counselor, who happens to be an operating thetan, somebody who's elevated higher than just a regular thetan, facilitates the individual's handling of their engrams. So Mr. Cruz, Mr. Travolta, and others have been to the auditing program using, by the way, what is known as an E-meter. It's a small electrical pulse thing that reads your electrical pulses. It's got a small electrical current, and you wear it through the auditing process so that the auditor can know whether or not you've really gotten rid of those engrams. And once you're done, that's a major goal, by the way, if you can be clear, according to the E-meter, of your engrams, your hangups. And that could be anywhere from morality to experiences that have happened to you, like tragic things. According to him, you have to get rid of that and have good analytical thinking to make your mind clear and ergo be an operating thetan. He called it exteriorization. And that is that the individual has to have his consciousness separated from his body. Believe that or not. The experience allowed him to see the spiritual self, that is you, by the way, as called the thetan, the true self, which does exist away from the body. Now, the Christians think the same thing. We believe our true self has got nothing to do with the body. The body's just a tent, and he's got that right. There's a soul. He didn't ever call it soul, but the true you is a soul/spirit, depending on if you're trichotomous or dichotomous in your approach to theology. And in that degrees, he's probably right. Bottom line is that true self, he started to believe that Thetans had inhabited other bodies before the present one. So whoever you are in your true self, you've had your true self somewhere else in time and space. That's his point. And what does that remind you of? If that doesn't remind you of Hinduism, those of you who were with me last week, I don't know what else does. That's exactly what the breaking of the 10 fetters is all about. Follow the Four Noble Path, eightfold path to righteousness, get rid of the 10 fetters. Why? Because you got to reincarnate yourself into nothingness, whether it's Buddha or Hindu, either way. Hindu into Brahman, the force. In Buddha, it's into nirvana, otherwise known as nothing. You create a nothingness of yourself. Very fascinating. And by the way, another side note, this also sounds a lot like Western Gnosticism. That is, a special knowledge comes into the mind and you are connected to God in a very special way. It's the same kind of thing. I could go on and on about that, but I'll wait for church history for that one. So Hubbard suggested that Thetans, you and me, originated billions of years ago with, quote, what he called, now catch this, he called it the original cause, capital C. On Q3, we talked about this at length. There's got to be an uncaused first cause in the universe. Now, we call it Jehovah God, duh, but other people might call it something else, like Brahman. But there's got to be an uncaused first cause, because there's no way that the law of cause and effect can work unless there is an uncaused first cause someplace. Whether you're a deist or a theist or a Scientologist, there's got to be an uncaused. And he picked it up right. There's an original cause someplace in time, right? And he's arguing that over time, Thetans interacted with what he called, now catch this, MEST. MEST, MEST. Mind, energy, space, time. MEST, capital MEST. He put that throughout his book. And he said once the Thetans started to think about matter, energy, space, and time, making the universe possible, he says that Thetans began to fall into MEST. That was an accident. And Thetans were always supposed to be above matter, energy, space, and time. And that's what these lovely little engram therapies are supposed to do, is to put you back above MEST. Isn't that fascinating? That way you can function without all of that. Now, I'm trying to think if I even wanted to go here. Nah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. I can hear you. You're still muted though. Unmute yourself completely. There you go.
Is that right? Okay, good. Where did Elron get his ideas? Just
Pure his mind.
okay.
There's no indication that he was influenced. Now, obviously, anybody that says that you're part of the animal kingdom is going to be influenced by John Stuart Mill, Margaret Mead, which would be contemporary books, utilitarianism, the life on the island of Samoa, or not Samoa, is that right? Yeah, Samoa. Those are all books that talk about how mankind is purely an animal, and ergo the survival of the fittest, and the survival issue. And I've talked to you a little bit. If you've listened to Q3, you know that we are in the Greek philosophical realm of Epicureanism. Now, that's really heady stuff, but bottom line, Epicureanism is that all that values in the world is pleasure. We're not Stoic anymore. That was the 50s. Today, we're Epicurean. There are 4 major Greek philosophies. They've ran the world course forever. They never change. It's Stoic, skeptic, cynic, Epicurean. And Epicurean is the love of pleasure. Well, L. Ron Hubbard is saying all your decisions need to help you survive. If it gives you pleasure, well, that's exactly what John Stuart Mill said in his book, Utilitarianism, which is 1860s. So he's being influenced here by maybe his George Washington University time of philosophers of his age. Margaret Sanger said the exact same thing when she talked about Planned Parenthood. You know, most of you probably know, and I don't want to go off on a rabbit track this late, but Margaret Sanger started Planned Parenthood for eugenics sakes, right? I mean, it was to keep the black kids from being born. I mean, that was the whole point. It was to purify the DNA, which she had proven is modeled by bad genes. Well, that's right out of Karl Marx's handbook. You know, bad genes is a bad idea. And of course, Mr. Hitler in Mein Kampf wrote about that. And then, of course, got a chance to experiment with it. So he said this, and I'm quoting now. I'll just quote this for you so you can hear his words out of Dianetics. Quote, "No culture in the history of the world, save thoroughly depraved ones, has failed to affirm the existence of a supreme being. It is an empirical, not empirical, empirical observation that men without a strong and lasting faith in a supreme being are less capable, less ethical, and less valuable to themselves and society." And in this case, he's going to say the supreme being is Thetans, that you have a spiritual plane. And he's right as rain. You do have a spiritual plane. And I can argue this on an intellectual basis. Forget the God and the Bible part. There's no question that mankind has a spiritual plane. And he's right. I mean, he's right. A supreme being. Now, the question is, who is that supreme being? Is it man, a la secular humanism? Or is it this Jehovah Jireh guy, the God who provides all the time, who is, in fact, not Allah, right? He's not Allah. Those are two different things, no matter what the Baha'i faith guys say. Okay, so anyway, he says that the church doesn't prescribe to teachings about God, but instead concentrates on helping people, you Thetan people, to realize your inherent spiritual essence. And that means you got to get rid of all your engrams. There are also, I'm not sure that it matters, but he resigned in 1966 from the Scientology church to focus on what he called different levels of clearness. So Thetan, not clear. Operating Thetan, clear. And then there's a whole series, and it goes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, all in Roman numerals, of levels of being clear. And it's called the Apollo. It's a boat he lived on, and he did research on that thing. And he dedicated to a small fraternity of dedicated church members with the most advanced teachings of Scientology. The organization is called the Flag Service Organization. It's based in Clearwater, Florida, highly secretive. Nobody the heck knows exactly what this operating Thetan clarity programs are, but there's several boats. I thought I wrote one down. Oh, Free Winds. That's it. Ha, makes sense. Free Winds, where you go aboard that ship and you get, and I think that's the highest one. Free Winds has the operating Thetan 8th class, V111. And nobody knows exactly what goes on in that. But as you know, there's been all sorts of controversy regarding Scientology and how they thought the government was after them. And they were. IRS said, hey, you guys aren't really what do you call it? A religion. So they redacted their tax exempt thing. Church Scientology sued them, and for I think it was 14 years, they fought. And by the way, the Church of Scientology won in 1993, and they actually sent a whole slew of people into the government to spy on them, and that's fact. They had a whole division of the Church of Scientology that did that just to find out what the government was doing against them. Really fascinating. A whole slew of people were fired from the Church of Scientology, and a whole slew of people were jailed for that spy thing. Now, the problem was that the American Academy of Psychiatric and something psychiatry thought that they were practicing medicine without a license, which the church fought back in court and said, well, yeah, but you're practicing medicine without recognizing there's a spiritual plane in man. So you're the one that's malpractice. And they went back and forth for years. I mean, like decades. And I actually kind of agree with Hubbard. I mean, psychiatry, many times they don't recognize the spiritual side of the coin and do some, in many cases, more harm than good. Well, Hubbard was fighting against that. And now there's a group that owns, I think it's called the Religious Training Center, I think RTC, and they own everything to do with Scientology, trademarks, writings, all that stuff. Or maybe it's called the RTC. I can't remember what the T stands for. Might be technology. I can't remember. It's been a long time. And in 1963, by the way, those e-meters, those little electric things that were tied to people, the FDA actually raided their main headquarters and took those to find out what the heck they were doing with them, because they thought they were unauthorized, things for diagnosis of disease, when in fact they weren't. They were just basically it's kind of like a lie detector test, where you can tell when somebody's electrical impulses are going up or down. That's basically all it was. Do I really want to? I don't think I care about any of this other stuff. They've been fighting with people in government forever. France and Germany confiscated all sorts of stuff. But just so you know, Scientology has operating centers in 150 countries. They are huge. There's a lot of people who buy that stuff. L. Ron Hubbard, Dianetics, the science of mind. Okay, ran out of time. We'll have to do Wicca next Sunday. Any questions or argument or comment of that ilk? Lost the chat. Where'd it go? Yeah, it's not aliens. Thetans are us. They're not a separate thing. They are you and I, even though there is some sect of Scientology that actually thinks that Thetans came from outer space and invaded mankind. Fascinating. As I told you, L. Ron Hubbard was a science fiction writer by trade.
And that's what religion is.
Yeah, maybe that's part of why some of it sounds a little Star Warsy. Any questions? Going once? Okay, well, the recording thing did something weird, so I'm not exactly sure what's happening with it, but we'll see if I can get Apollo to put it online, and we'll go from there. Otherwise, next time we will be talking about Wicca. I've got all my notes all over the place. Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. So those will be the 3 ones for next week. Otherwise, take care. Send me an email if you have any questions, if you think about it later, and we will talk to you later.
That was interesting.
Yeah.